Welcome to the Astronomers for Planet Earth webinar series, hosted by Dr. Travis Rector, Professor of Astrophysics at University of Alaska, Anchorage. Today's guest is Noah Planavsky. Noah Planavsky is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Yale University, where he moved after doing thesis work at University of California, Riverside, and a postdoc at Caltech. He's an isotope geochemist that works on environmental change in Earth's past, present, and future. His work combines field studies, analytical chemistry, novel isotope systems, and geochemical modeling. He has worked extensively on atmospheric evolution, particularly on changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations, and planetary habitability. Current projects focus on changes in ocean oxygen levels, tracking how primary productivity has changed through time, and on the potential for carbon capture through enhanced mineral weathering in marine and terrestrial environments.
Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Rector, and I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I'm also one of the organizers for a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth, which is a group that's helping astronomers to address the issue of climate change. And our speaker today is Dr. Noah Planavsky, who's an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Yale University. And we're especially excited to have him talking with us today because he's going to talk about the topic of planetary habitability as well as carbon capture, which are two topics that I think are very common for us as astronomers to talk about in our classes. Noah, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be able to share. So what I wanted to do today was give an overview of some of my research and walk through an idea of how my research, both on thinking about Earth's long-term evolution, thinking about how that fits into our understanding of Earth-like exoplanets, and how thinking about how we can have meaningful climate mitigation over the next century or the next 1,000 years are all closely related topics that share some common tools and some common themes. So my research in general, my research group really focuses in detail on studying how Earth's atmosphere has changed through time and thinking about how the life on Earth has transformed our atmosphere and has ensured that we've remained this persistently inhabited place for persistently inhabited planet for billions of years, and thinking about how some of the concepts that we learn by studying Earth can be applied to Earth-like exoplanets. And we like to think of Earth, and the broader team that I'm part of is referred to as the alternative Earth team. We like to think of Earth really as a series of planets that can provide us insights into how planets in general behave and regulate. And a large part of my research also focuses on, if we want to imagine another alternative Earth, trying to imagine an Earth that doesn't emit massive amounts of carbon dioxide at an unprecedented rate in Earth's history, that actually has a carbon cycle that is more balanced and is unlikely to lead to significant environmental and economic degradation. So we'll walk you through in the next couple minutes here an example of how these seemingly disparate topics actually, I think, are quite closely interconnected. So I got interested in studying atmospheric CO2, not by thinking about where we're going over the next 100 years, but when I was an undergraduate student, actually, so many years ago, I got really taken by the concept of what regulated Earth's long-term habitability. And the first paper I remember being totally blown away with was some of the first papers were things on the faint young sun paradox. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the faint young sun paradox, this idea that just as the solar luminosity has almost certainly increased significantly through time, the temperature of Earth has remained relatively constant or potentially even cooled. So without some significant amount of extra greenhouse gases, the Earth would have been very cold, very ice covered, and likely largely uninhabitable in Earth's early history. But we know that wasn't the case. So something was really fundamentally different through most of Earth's history for how atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are regulated and how the carbon cycle worked. And to me, that was a fascinating idea, and that there was still debate about that was a fascinating concept to me, which got me interested in trying to explore what controls atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, which is the kind of ultimate or the main greenhouse gas. So if we want to think about how Earth's carbon cycle or how greenhouse gas regulation could have been fundamentally different in Earth's past, it's good to start at what is generally agreed upon to be the most basic concept of what controls atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations on long time scales. And that is, without question, the idea that we have silicate weathering removing CO2 sourced from Earth's interior. Volcanogenic CO2, when it interacts with a silicate, any cation-bearing silicate, will remove atmospheric CO2, and if that results in the precipitation of calcium carbonate, will transfer carbon from the atmosphere to a rock reservoir. This equation is referred to as the Urey reaction, but the regulation of Earth's climate by this process is often referred to as the silicate weathering feedback. And this is a feedback because the amount of CO2 that is removed is going to be dependent on the temperature, which will have reactions occurring, weathering reactions occurring faster, and the amount of rainfall you have, the amount of precipitation you have in the system, which will again foster more intensive silicate weathering. Right? So the standard view of what is regulated as long-term climate on geologically meaningful timescales is this silicate weathering feedback. And the silicate weathering feedback ensures that there is a perfect balance between the amount of carbon sourced from volcanoes, from Earth's interior, and the amount that is removed into the rock reservoir. And if this wasn't the case, the Earth would have spun out of control into a runaway greenhouse state like Venus, or we would have had extremely icy conditions and been in likely a snowball Earth state, which would be largely uninhabitable. Okay. So in order to explain Earth's past, though, as I said before, there's something needed to be fundamentally different about how this process has operated. Something needed to be fundamentally different about the silicate weathering feedback. So I've been exploring several aspects of this. One, that the terrestrial weathering process could be fundamentally different. But one of the other things that I've been exploring is, rather than just focusing on what's happening in continental settings, been thinking about what would have been happening also in the oceans in terms of this carbon cycle. And specifically, instead of just burying carbonates, which leads to long-term sequestration of carbon dioxide, been exploring the idea, members of my group have been exploring the idea that if you precipitate silicate phases in the oceans instead of carbonates, which is often referred to as reverse silicate weathering, you can actually retain carbon within the ocean atmosphere system. And this is in effect a net source of CO2. So instead of thinking about just the terrestrial silicate weathering feedback, maybe a more appropriate way to think about the carbon cycle on Earth and in Earth-like exoplanets would be to think about a system where a large part of the climate regulation actually occurs in the oceans as well, where we can take the weathering products of silicate weathering and form additional silicates, undoing that weathering process and bumping up atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And so why would this have been different in Earth's past? Right now, as some folks would be familiar with, but some folks probably won't, the silicon cycle is strongly controlled by organisms. So almost all of the silica moving through Earth's oceans right now flows through organisms. So that includes radiolarians, which are heterotrophic protists. That includes sponges, which are basal animals. And more recently, this includes diatoms, which are a photosynthetic algae. And so all of these organisms use energy to take up silica concentrations and bring it to really, really low concentrations in the oceans. And what that means is that silica phases are low, that makes it more difficult to form silicate phases in the oceans. And as a result, this reverse weathering process, this formation of silicate minerals in the ocean, is relatively slow and relatively unimportant in the carbon cycle. But all of these organisms evolved relatively recently in Earth's history. So one of my questions, one of the things we've been exploring, this is work I should say I did with one of my students, Terry Izen foremost, was trying to understand if without all of these organisms, if reverse weathering would have been very extensive. And what we've done is modified a Earth system model that tracks how carbon is cycled through Earth's surface, through Earth's history, and came up with the point that this process can change atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations by hundreds to thousands of parts per million. Massive changes in carbon dioxide concentrations. And in fact, if we allow reverse weathering to evolve dynamically with boundary conditions that are reasonable for the Earth system, we can get carbon dioxide concentrations through its history that allow the Earth to be climate over the past 3.5 billion years. In other words, reverse weathering provides a relatively simple solution to the faint young sun paradox. Okay? So reverse weathering, interestingly, can shape planetary habitability. And that is something that's a very different process than what we typically think of. And this has a lot of relevance for how we think about exoplanets, Earth-like exoplanets as well, Earth-like planets outside of our solar system. So one of the obvious things from this is if we reimagine climate regulation, this gives us a very different sense of what would be happening on planets that don't have significant continental exposure. So if you had a more fluid-rich Earth-like planet, in the traditional framework, that would be something that had very poor climate regulation. But in our proposed framework, where reverse weathering is this really important process, it could be actually a very well-regulated planet. This also helps warm planets, basically. So planets on the outer edge of the habitable zone, as traditionally defined, are actually much more likely to be habitable once you consider that reverse weathering is likely to be a significant process. So that's really reimagining a very different carbon cycle. The other type of reimagining of a different carbon cycle that I've been doing is thinking about how we can move into a system where we're not emitting massive amounts of carbon dioxide. And for many people that are familiar with this, there's certainly the need to move relatively rapidly to net zero emissions. But the longer we do that, the more we're going to be dependent on having actually gross negative emissions to stay at temperatures that the IPCC or the part of the Paris Accord agreed would keep us in a temperature regime that would prevent widespread environmental, economic degradation, widespread environmental and economic degradation. Okay? So this figure, I think, illustrates that nicely, where if the longer we move to net zero emissions, the more we're going to be dependent on having these negative emissions. The other way to look at that this is a figure now from the IPCC, is looking at illustrative pathways where you have a more realistic representation of CO2 emissions and the temperatures which those will cause. And in all of the scenarios where we can remain below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we end up having to have really significant billions of tons of CO2 carbon capture over an extended period. And that is on top of, I should stress, moving to net zero emissions. So what I've been excited about is, again, let's reimagine a carbon cycle. How can we imagine a scenario where we have not the massive positive emissions we have right now, but the massive amount of negative emissions that are necessary to meet our climate goals? And been thinking about this again in two ways, thinking about this in what can we do in terms of terrestrial carbon dioxide removal, and what can we do in terms of carbon dioxide removal in the oceans? And the main process that I've been thinking about is the same process that regulates Earth's long-term climate regulation. This is having CO2 interact with silicate minerals. And the silicate mineral that's best suited for this is basalt, which importantly is incredibly common component of Earth's surface. So for basalt, we have enough basalt that even if we think about just removing a small portion of the basalt, this is 10% of basalt in terrestrial settings over the surface, we can remove not only all of the carbon we've released to date, we could even remove all of the proven reserves, carbon reserves, and even all of the proven and unconventional reserves. And hopefully we don't move to this stage, but this is just meant to illustrate that even if we only consider basalt in terrestrial settings, we have a massive, massive amount of basalt that could allow us to remove all of the carbon that we've released. And that, of course, becomes even more of the case if we consider that the oceans, the oceanic crust of Earth, is largely composed of basalt. Okay. So one of the main questions with this, right, is we know that this process of silicate weathering regulates Earth's climate on really long timescales, on 100,000-year timescales, on million-year timescales. The question that is important for thinking about carbon capture is, can this actually occur on a timescale that is relevant to our current climate catastrophe? And there are a number of processes that can really speed this up. One of the most basic that can speed this up and put this process of CO2 removal with silicate weathering on an anthropogenic timescale. One of the most obvious ones that I'm interested in and have been exploring is that as we move to smaller grain sizes, as we dramatically increase the surface area of basalt grains, we really increase the time of dissolution, right? So this is showing different rates of mineral dissolution, and this is showing the time in which it would take to dissolve 90% of that grain. The problem, of course, with moving to smaller grain sizes is that it costs more money to grind the basalt to a smaller size. But as you notice, the grinding costs for this process, this is dollars per ton of rock, are not outrageous. Okay, and importantly, now the color contours are exactly the same that I showed before. In which you'll notice if we want to be on a time scale of an annual to decadal capture, we have to be in this orange and red color. And importantly, for grain sizes that are feasible economically, we have massive portions where we could have this capture process occurring, including in some of the most productive agricultural regions where we would have infrastructure to be able to spread massive amounts of this crushed basalt. Okay. So current estimates of the amount of carbon that we could capture through this process are roughly 10% of current emissions, in prices that are comparable to some of the other commonly discussed carbon capture mechanisms. And importantly as well, there are, unlike many of the processes that have been discussed for carbon capture, there are a bunch of co-benefits, positive co-benefits associated with this process. So specifically, when we apply crushed basalt to agricultural settings or to forest settings, it actually improves the growth of the basalt. In many cases, you have upwards of a 15 to 25% increase in the yields in certain crops with the addition of basalt. And it also, the waste product of this is ocean alkalinity, which in most projections, an increase of which is going to be essential to ensure long-term health of calcifying marine organisms for most coral reefs. And this is something that I'm excited about enough that we have moved into doing experiments. We have geochemical models that predict how rapidly this occurs and where we can do this. And right now we're in the process of testing our geochemical models with actual farm and agricultural settings. So this is a example of some images from the farm that we're currently using, which is in my home state, Wisconsin. What I mentioned before is that also the other thing that I'm interested for this is in doing this same process in marine settings. And the same idea, it's the exact same idea. You have silicate minerals interacting with CO2, but in the ocean. And the benefit of this process is, of course, that the oceans are massive. So we've been developing models to be able to explore how accurately this process could occur. And the models that we're using are the same models that actually we're using to predict how the Earth became oxygenated and how organic carbon would be buried in marine sediments. The exact same code we've developed, we're applying to how we can think about modeling basalt weathering in the oceans. And this is work that was done by one of my postdocs and just published this year. We also, what I should say, is that not only can we predict what's happening in the water column, but we can accurately predict what's happening with biogeochemical cycling and basalt weathering occurring in marine sediments as well. So this will allow us a full look at how much carbon we can actually capture through basalt weathering on basalt weathering in the oceans. And the number, in contrast to what I showed you for agricultural settings, if we consider all shallow water ocean settings, has the potential to be much larger. So this is showing a relatively high application rate of basalt, but what is in theory possible over all shallow water settings. And as you can tell, over several hundred to 200 year timescale, we can have massive drawdown of CO2. And in the process of this, we will significantly change the saturation state of calcium carbonate minerals, aragonite in this case, which will make it much more likely that even though we've injected a massive amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, that calcifying organisms will be stable on 100-year timescales instead of suffering from extensive amounts of acid added to the oceans from our fossil fuel burning. So, and I will wrap it up with that and just thank my funding sources and conclude with hopefully have made a case to you that the idea of thinking about how planets work, whether that is through Earth's history, whether that is thinking about planets in general and thinking about Earth-like planets outside of our solar system, and thinking about the future Earth are all very closely related in terms of the basic concepts we need to be thinking about, but also in some very real terms in terms of the actual tools and code that we develop. And I'm extremely grateful to my main funding sources, which is this Alternative Earths Astrobiology Institute, which is now one of the ICAR teams funded by NASA, and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Noah, for your talk. It was really interesting. Well, I have lots of questions, and I know our audience will as well. And so I look forward to the Q&A session to discuss that. So thank you so much for meeting with us today.
We hope you've enjoyed today's talk. Each of our talks is followed with a Q&A session that you can learn more about in the video description. If you're interested in Astronomers for Planet Earth, you can learn more at our website, astronomersforplanet.earth, and on social media as well. If you would like to be notified about future talks and events, please follow and join us.